Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The Abbott Mansion, usually a place of elegance, tradition, and family, became a living nightmare in an instant when Jack Abbott pushed through the doors and stumbled upon a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life: his son, Kyle, lying sprawled across the marble floor, a pool of blood spreading beneath him like a grotesque halo, the metallic tang already choking the air, and Jack's world collapsing as he froze in disbelief before instincts took over and he dropped to his knees beside his boy, clutching at his shirt to stem the bleeding, frantically calling his name, begging him to stay with him, his heart pounding with the desperate knowledge that every second mattered, while his mind spun through the unthinkable questions: who would dare do this, who had hunted down his son, who had wanted him silenced in such a brutal way? As Kyle's eyes fluttered weakly, a whispered name passed his lips, barely audible, but enough to chill Jack's blood because the man responsible wasn't some faceless thug or random criminal. It was someone who had been inside their circle, someone they had trusted, someone who had smiled at their table and shaken their hands, and Jack's horror deepened as he realized the shooter was none other than Jeremy Stark, the relentless predator who had stalked their family months before, a man Jack had thought rid of, a man he had believed locked away in the darkness of prison cells and far from their lives, but now proven to be back with vengeance burning in his eyes and revenge carved into his twisted soul. The shot fired at Kyle a message to Jack himself, a punishment for crossing him, for taking Diane away from his grasp, for daring to win the battle Stark had sworn to dominate. But the tragedy didn't stop there, because Jack knew immediately this shooting wasn't just about Stark targeting Kyle randomly. It was calculated, personal, a strike designed to cut Jack in the most vulnerable place possible, because Stark could have aimed at Jack. He could have come for Diane, but instead he chose Kyle, the son who carried Jack's legacy, the heir to the Abbott name, a young man just beginning to piece his life together again after heartbreaks and betrayals, only to now be ripped apart by a bullet meant to destroy not just flesh but spirit. And as Jack cradled him, screaming for help, his cries echoing off the walls, the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. Yet beneath the fear, anger began to take root, a fiery determination to make Stark pay for every drop of blood his son had lost, for every tear shed on that cold marble floor. And as paramedics arrived, chaos unfolded. Diane rushed in, her scream piercing the night as she fell to her knees. Nikki Newman was called by Summer, who sobbed uncontrollably. Phyllis arrived too late but caught a glimpse of Kyle being wheeled out, and her face hardened with rage, realizing Stark's game wasn't finished, that he was out there somewhere watching them all crumble, relishing the devastation he'd caused. And in that moment alliances shifted, because though the Abbotts had fought fiercely among themselves, all their disputes vanished in the face of this attack, replaced with a singular, consuming mission: find Jeremy Stark and end this nightmare before he could strike again. And as Jack followed the gurney out, his hands still sticky with his son's blood, he whispered a vow to the night sky that Stark wouldn't win, that Kyle would live, that no matter how dark or ruthless he had to become, he would hunt down the man who had dared to shoot his son, the man who had crossed a line that could never be forgiven. For the Abbott patriarch had just been awakened into a war, and Jack Abbott in war is a force no one should ever underestimate. Jack's hand shook as the paramedics loaded Kyle onto the stretcher, his mind caught between the horror of the blood on his palms and the rage bubbling inside him, a storm of grief and fury that threatened to consume him whole. Because even as the sirens wailed and the ambulance roared into the night, Jack knew the battle wasn't just in the hospital room where doctors would fight to save his son, it was also out in the streets, in the shadows where Jeremy Stark lurked, a venomous ghost from their past that had returned to destroy them. And the thought that Kyle's life hung by a thread because of Stark's vendetta was almost too much to bear, driving Jack into a place he hadn't been since the days of corporate wars and ruthless battles over Jabot. Except this was no boardroom fight, this was blood for blood, and Jack was ready to wage war with everything he had. Diane clung to his arm, her tears streaming down her face, repeating over and over that Kyle would make it, that he was strong. But Jack could see the guilt etched in her features, because deep down Diane knew this had been Stark's message to her too: punishment for rejecting him, for reuniting with Jack, for daring to hope for a life of redemption when Stark had promised her only destruction. And now that bill had come due in the cruelest way imaginable, through their son's suffering. Meanwhile, Summer's cries echoed in the hospital corridor as she held Harrison close, trying to shield him from the truth but unable to stop her own body from trembling, the terror of possibly losing Kyle sinking into her bones like poison, and when Phyllis arrived, red-haired fury blazing like fire, she didn't hesitate to lash out, hurling accusations that Diane's past, Diane's choices, Diane's dangerous ties had led to this, that if Diane had stayed away from Genoa City, Jeremy Stark would never have resurfaced. And while Jack wanted to silence Phyllis for her cruelty in that moment, some small, gnawing voice inside him wondered if there was a sliver of truth, because no matter how much he loved Diane, no matter how much he believed she had changed, it was undeniable that Stark's obsession with her had brought this storm crashing down on all of them, yet blame would not save Kyle, and Jack refused to let grief be the only force guiding him. He needed action, he needed answers, and he needed to know how Stark had slipped through the cracks, how a man supposedly neutralized had resurfaced with a gun and a plan. And when Chance Chancellor showed up at the hospital to begin his investigation, Jack all but grabbed him by the collar demanding justice, insisting that Stark be hunted down like the rabid dog he was, but Chance, ever the professional, urged caution, telling Jack that if Stark had fired at Kyle then this was only the beginning, that Stark was making a statement and likely had more moves in play, and Jack, though seething, understood the unspoken warning, that the Abbotts needed to brace themselves for further attacks. Across town, Victor Newman heard the news from Adam, who relayed it with an uncharacteristic mix of anger and unease, and Victor's expression hardened into a mask of icy resolve, because while Victor and Jack had their endless rivalries, Victor Newman was a father first, and the idea of an outsider daring to take a shot at an Abbott heir, something that could just as easily happen to one of his own children, was an offense Victor would not abide. And so he ordered his men to gather intelligence on Stark, already envisioning the trap he would set, not out of charity for Jack but because in Genoa City there were lines you simply did not cross, and shooting Kyle Abbott was one of them. Back at the hospital, Jack sat vigil at Kyle's bedside after emergency surgery, watching the rise and fall of his chest with every machine beep a cruel reminder that his son's fate wasn't in his hands. And as he whispered promises to Kyle about fighting for him, about being stronger than Stark's darkness, about holding on because Harrison needed his father, Diane needed her son, and Jack needed his boy more than life itself, Jack's resolve hardened into something unbreakable. He wasn't just going to wait for the law to handle Jeremy Stark, he was going to find him himself, and if it meant staining his own hands in blood to protect his family, then so be it. Because the rules of decency no longer applied when the lives of the people he loved were on the line. Summer, meanwhile, retreated to the chapel, where she fell to her knees and begged for a miracle, begging not only for Kyle's life but also for clarity, because her heart was being pulled in 1,000 directions, toward Harrison, toward her husband, toward her fury at Diane, and even toward the memories of how many times Phyllis had warned her that danger seemed to follow the Abbotts whenever Diane was near. And when Phyllis herself appeared in the chapel, the mother-daughter moment was as volatile as it was tender, Phyllis swearing to Summer that she would not rest until Jeremy Stark paid, that she would dig through every connection, every underground lead, every ally she had left to make sure he couldn't breathe without looking over his shoulder, because if the law wouldn't stop him, she would. Meanwhile, Stark himself sat in the shadows of a seedy motel, watching the chaos unfold on his burner phone, a smirk curling his lips as news reports speculated on Kyle's condition, because for him this wasn't just revenge, it was sport, it was power, it was proof that no matter how far the Abbotts thought they'd buried him, Jeremy Stark could always crawl back out of the grave, and in his twisted mind, he was just getting started, because one bullet wasn't enough, one pool of blood wasn't the endgame, no. Stark wanted Jack broken, shattered, stripped of everything and everyone he loved, and what better way to destroy him than through the people closest to him, one by one, until Jack was left standing alone in the ruins of his family, screaming into the void. Back at the hospital, Billy arrived, his usual swagger gone, replaced by uncharacteristic dread, and though he and Kyle had never always seen eye to eye, seeing his nephew nearly stolen by violence lit something inside him too, and he vowed to Jack that whatever needed to be done, however far outside the law it required them to go, he was in, because Stark wasn't going to stop, and the Abbotts couldn't just stand still and wait to be picked off, they had to strike back with everything they had, and Jack, hearing those words, realized the family was at a crossroads. Either they rose together in unity or they fell apart under Stark's assault, and for the first time in years, Jack felt the weight of the Abbott legacy not just as a company or a name but as a bloodline under siege, and he knew, deep down, this war with Stark was only beginning. The Abbott mansion, once the crown jewel of their legacy, a place where family photographs lined the hallways and laughter had often echoed during dinners and holidays, was now stained with the unforgettable image of Kyle's blood seeping into its marble floors, and as Jack replayed that moment in his mind on a loop while he sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room of Memorial Hospital, he felt as though time itself had split in two, before the gunshot, when he still believed his family could heal, and after the gunshot, when nothing would ever be the same again, because Jeremy Stark had not only aimed a weapon at Kyle's body but had fired directly into the heart of the Abbott family itself, tearing open old wounds and sparking a firestorm of vengeance that was already beginning to consume everyone in its path. Jack sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, blood still under his fingernails, staring at the floor as though answers might materialize in the bland hospital tile. While Diane sat beside him clutching his arms so tightly her nails dug into his skin, whispering prayers, apologies, and desperate reassurances in equal measure, her guilt radiating so fiercely that Jack could almost feel it bleeding into him, and though he wanted to comfort her, though he wanted to absolve her, he couldn't, because the truth was that Stark had always been drawn to her, obsessed with her, and though she hadn't pulled the trigger, her connection to him had given Stark the perfect weapon to destroy their family. And the knowledge of that truth gnawed at Jack's insides. Across the hall, Summer's sobs were muffled against Harrison's hair as she rocked him back and forth in the pediatric waiting area, trying to shield him from the horror but failing to shield herself from the unbearable terror that Kyle might not make it through the night, and every time she thought of their last conversation, so ordinary, so mundane, her chest cracked a little more at the idea that those could have been the final words they ever shared. When Phyllis stormed in, her presence was like a thunderclap in the already stormy atmosphere, her fiery hair a crown of rage and her voice slicing through the silence as she railed against Diane, accusing her of dragging danger back into their lives, insisting that this was the exact nightmare she had warned Summer about, and though Jack tried to rise and silence her tirade, Phyllis's words landed like daggers in Diane's heart, fueling the guilt she already couldn't escape, and when Summer broke down, pleading with both women to stop fighting and focus on Kyle, the entire corridor seemed to shudder under the weight of their fractured alliances. In another corner of the hospital, Chance Chancellor quietly gathered evidence, speaking with officers and canvassing witnesses, but his gaze kept drifting back toward Jack, knowing the man's fury was boiling just beneath the surface, and while Chance respected Jack's pain, he also feared what Jack might do if Kyle didn't make it. Because Jack Abbott might have been a businessman, a patriarch, a man of principle, but he was also a man who had lost too much already, and Jeremy Stark's calculated cruelty might just push him into a darkness he couldn't crawl back from. Elsewhere in Genoa City, Victor Newman received the news from Adam, and for a long moment the great mogul simply stood in his study, glass of brandy untouched, eyes narrowed in contemplation, because while he and Jack had fought bitterly for decades, Victor understood one thing better than anyone: when an enemy strikes at a man's child, it is not just violence, it is war. And Jeremy Stark had just declared war not only on the Abbotts but on the delicate balance of power in Genoa City itself, and Victor, never one to ignore a threat, began issuing quiet orders to his men to trace Stark's movements, to dig into every possible contact, already thinking several moves ahead about how he might use this crisis both to protect his own family and perhaps tighten his grip over Jack in the process. Stark himself, meanwhile, sat in the dingy room of a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, a single lamp casting long shadows across his smirking face as he scrolled through the online reports of Kyle's condition. Savoring every headline, every whispered rumor, every shred of chaos he had unleashed, because this was never just about one bullet, this was about domination, about proving that he could shatter the Abbotts whenever he pleased, and as he replayed the memory of pulling the trigger, he didn't just see Kyle bleeding, he saw Jack kneeling, helpless, desperate, and broken, and that image was more intoxicating than any drug or fortune could ever be. Back at Memorial, the family's vigil stretched into the early hours of the morning, with Billy arriving to find Jack sitting motionless, his eyes bloodshot and hollow, and though Billy had never shied away from criticizing Jack's choices in the past, In that moment he simply placed a hand on his brother's shoulder and told him they would find Stark together, whatever it took, even if it meant breaking the law, because some crimes couldn't be answered in courtrooms, some demanded blood for blood, and Jack, gripping Billy's hand, felt a grim solidarity he hadn't felt in years, the two brothers united not by business but by vengeance. Diane, meanwhile, slipped into Kyle's room once the doctors allowed visitors, and she collapsed at his bedside, clutching his hand and whispering apologies for everything she had ever done that had brought Stark into their lives, begging her son to hold on, to come back to her, to not let Stark win. And though Kyle lay unconscious, the faintest twitch of his fingers gave her a flicker of hope, a fragile thread she clung to desperately. Outside, Summer and Phyllis continued their tense exchange, with Phyllis vowing that if the police failed, she herself would track down Stark, invoking her old hacker instincts and connections, and Summer, torn between her mother's ferocity and her need for stability, realized she might have no choice but to let both Phyllis and Jack plunge into their own kind of darkness if it meant keeping Kyle alive. And through it all, Jack sat there, haunted by the sight of his son on the floor, haunted by the whispered name that had escaped Kyle's lips, haunted by the knowledge that Jeremy Stark had dared to invade the sanctity of his home, and as dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky in muted grays, Jack finally stood, straightened his shoulders, and declared in a voice so cold it sent shivers through everyone in the room that Jeremy Stark would not get away with this, that whether it took days or weeks or months, he would find him, and when he did, there would be no forgiveness, no deals, no second chances. There would only be Jack Abbott's revenge, and Jeremy Stark would learn that when you spill Abbott blood, you sign your own death warrant. As Jack's vow hung in the sterile hospital air like a death sentence, the Abbotts, the Newmans, and even the unlikely outsiders orbiting their family all felt the ripple of what it meant. A line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed, and though everyone prayed for Kyle's recovery, the truth was that the shooting had awakened something in Jack Abbott that could not be soothed by police reports or legal justice. Because Jack's fury was not the quiet, simmering kind, it was the sort that hardened into resolve with every passing second, and as he paced the hospital corridors in the hours after Kyle's surgery, still wearing the same shirt stained with his son's blood, he began making calls, reaching out to contacts he hadn't used in years, men and women who owed him favors, men and women who lived in the gray shadows of Genoa City where rules bent and secrets thrived, because if Stark thought he could play this game, Jack would show him just how ruthless an Abbott could be. Diane, terrified by the fire in his eyes, begged him to let Chance and the GCPD handle it, pleaded with him not to go down a path of destruction that would only make Stark the winner in the end, but Jack silenced her with a look so sharp it cut through the air, telling her that this was not about business or reputation anymore. This was about family, about protecting the blood that carried their name, about making sure Harrison would never again be left crying in his mother's arms because his father had been ripped from him by a maniac's bullet. Meanwhile, Phyllis had already launched her own war room, hunched over her laptop in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, fingers flying as she tapped into old systems she swore she'd left behind, determined to track Stark digitally, to follow his money, his burner phones, his aliases, because if Jack was waging his war in the streets, Phyllis would wage hers in the shadows of cyberspace, and though Summer tried to stop her, insisting that dragging herself back into this world would only lead to ruin, Phyllis brushed her off with a grim smile, saying Stark had already ruined everything, and she would rather burn herself out than let him think he had won. Across town, Victor convened with Adam and Nick, laying out a plan to fold Stark into the Newman radar.